The war on Gaza has opened another front on U.S. politics. Today, we look into what the most influential pro-Israel lobby group is doing to keep America's unconditional and multi-billion-dollar support. I'm Anelise Borges, and this is The Stream.
Good morning, AIPAC. Good morning. What an honor.
Please welcome Senate Democratic Leader,
the Senate Republican Leader.
Please welcome Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives.
Please welcome Secretary of State.
I'm honored to introduce the Vice President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Could you imagine if Russia or China boasted about how much they control U.S. elections?
AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has officially spent more than $100 million in this year's political races in the U.S. Its objective, get rid of the few but passionate pro-Palestine voices in Congress and keep the status quo. This is the U.S. House of Representatives, the body responsible for keeping the U.S. president in check, but also vetting policies such as the $14 billion supplemental funding for Israel, approved by Congress last April. In black, members supported by AIPAC. What does this mean for the American people who may not agree with funding war and genocide instead of healthcare and education? To discuss, we're joined today by Usamah Andrabi, Communications Director at Justice Democrats, a progressive organization and part of a Reject AIPAC coalition. Eva Borgwardt, spokesperson for IfNotNow, the American Jewish group campaigning to end U.S. support for Israel's apartheid system. And Akela Lacy, a senior politics reporter at the Intercept. Thank you all so much for your time today. Thank you for joining us. I would like to start, if you will, with a bit of historical context here. Usamah, where did AIPAC come from? And can you walk us through the trajectory it has taken to get here?
Yeah, so AIPAC has long existed in American politics for nearly half a century as a lobbying operation, pushing members of Congress, the president, and other elected officials to pass U.S. policies that unconditionally support the far-right government in Israel. They've existed in that lobbying form for decades upon decades, and that's why the U.S. has unconditionally supported Israel for so long through its policies. But what happened in the last cycle, 2022, AIPAC launched for the first time a PAC and a super PAC, which allowed it to spend directly in U.S. elections for the first time ever. And in their first cycle, they spent $27 million in just 9 Democratic primaries. And this cycle, as you noted, they've already spent $100 million in mostly Democratic primaries and overwhelmingly funded by Republican mega donors and right-wing interests. In fact, 9 of the top 10 mega donors to AIPAC Super PAC are Republican mega donors or Trump billionaires, and they've used that money specifically to target progressive Democrats who have been supportive of Palestinian human rights and Palestinian lives, but as well as any Democrat who even has a whiff of criticism for the Netanyahu regime.
And so, Akela, we're basically talking about money when it comes to the strategy and the methods that AIPAC uses to influence politics in America today?
Yes, effectively. There has been a lot of quibbling, in U.S. Political circles after the losses of several squad members who came under fire from AIPAC money about how much politics played into these races. But the staggering amount of money, the historic nature of the amounts that AIPAC is spending, they spent close to $30 million to oust these 2 progressive members of the squad, making those 2 races 2 of the most expensive Democratic primary races in U.S. history. And so you can't really discount the impact that historic change in spending has on these elections. they also are using this money to fund political ads that are barraging constituents in districts. I was in one of the media markets that got some of the ads for Jamal Bowman's race, and literally every 5 minutes there are ads, bashing Bowman. None of these ads mention Israel, which is part of AIPAC strategy that we can get into later. But particularly in American media markets, the ability to have this much money to flood all media streams with attacks on these candidates makes an incredibly large difference when you're talking about the resources that the candidates who are being attacked have in comparison. And so, in the U.S. And in politics in general, money talks. And AIPAC has found that its unlimited amount of funding from right-wing billionaires and conservative Democrats as well gives it a leg up that no other outside group in U.S. politics has at this moment in time.
Eva, maybe I'm simplifying things too much here, but are they basically buying elections? And how dangerous is this to U.S. democracy?
It's extremely dangerous. I mean, this is a core problem in American politics broadly, that because of Citizens United, we have corporations treated as people in American politics, and special interest groups can flood any election with millions and millions of dollars. And that's a problem anywhere. And we're seeing in these extremely dramatic AIPAC primaries, which, as Akela said, are these past two this summer were two of the most expensive in history, that you have an organization mostly funded by far-right billionaires, which is able to defeat working class candidates of color, Black candidates who are backed by the majority of the people in their district, and it's limiting the political power of the majority of Americans. And meanwhile, AIPAC has endorsed, we saw in the 2022 cycle, 109 insurrectionist Republicans, and so they have made extremely clear that they are willing to contribute to undermining U.S. democracy. And the question is, what is the Democratic Party going to do about it?
We're going to talk more about what the U.S. Democratic Party might do about it. But at the start of the show, we looked into how the U.S. Congress is divided today. And here's U.S. Representative Thomas Massie on how AIPAC operates among them. Take a listen.
Everybody but me has an AIPAC person.
What does that mean, an AIPAC person?
It's like your babysitter, your AIPAC babysitter, who is always talking to you for AIPAC. They're probably a constituent in your district, but they are firmly embedded in AIPAC. And
every member has something like this?
That's how it works on the Republican side. And when they come to D.C., you go have lunch with them. And they've got your cell number, and you have conversations with them.
That's absolutely crazy.
I've had 4 members of Congress say, I'll talk to my AIPAC person. And it's literally what we call them, my AIPAC guy. I'll talk to my AIPAC guy and see if I can get him to dial those ads back.
Why have I never heard this before?
Why would they want to tell their constituents that they've basically got a buddy system with somebody who's representing a foreign country? It doesn't benefit the congressman for people to know that, so they're not going to tell you that.
Usamah, my AIPAC guy, I mean, is that quite shocking only to me? How aware is the American public about this operation?
Well, AIPAC is a symptom of a much larger problem, to Eva's point, which is the preponderance of big money in politics and lobbies to influence our politics. I think the American people understand that there are corporate right-wing super PACs who are trying to spend millions of dollars to influence our members of Congress. But I think there is not this level of understanding about how much AIPAC does do, how much they've done for decades, and how they're doing it on both sides of the equation here. Obviously AIPAC has guys and people who are touch points for every member of Congress who has their support. They're doing that on the Hill in Washington, D.C. every year, while in our elections, they're spending millions and millions of dollars to say, don't even think about criticizing the Israeli government, because if you do, we're going to spend $20 million in a Democratic primary against you. And so this is how the kind of cycle of lobbying and influence works in our U.S. election system. We continue to fund the candidates who say what we want them to say in Congress, and then we'll spend millions of dollars on their elections, ensuring they get reelected or elected for the first time. And there's only a handful of members of Congress who are willing to stand up to AIPAC and all the corporate lobbies in Congress to say we are going to be unbought. We are not going to be influenced by your decision making, and instead we're going to be influenced by our moral compass and, frankly, U.S. law, which should state that we should not be supporting the unconditional funding of the Israeli military as it commits a genocide in front of our eyes.
There's definitely an argument here in terms of what kinds of reforms are needed in U.S. politics today when you talk about big money, because we see a country where, I mean, at least in parts of it, the homelessness crisis is massive. There's so much more things that could be done with this money. That's what I mean. Akela, the House Democratic Squad, you mentioned them. They rose to prominence 5 years ago. A lot has happened since. But can you tell us who they are today and why AIPAC would potentially want them out?
So this is the piece of AIPAC's strategy that I think gets lost on a lot of people, particularly, after October 7th. AIPAC has been able to portray itself as a group that supports the Israeli people, supports Israel against attacks like what happened on October 7th. But the reality is that AIPAC has been building this influence in Washington, as Usamah said, for half a century to maintain silence within the Democratic Party and the Republican Party about the longstanding support that the U.S. has given to the Israeli military. And so after October 7th, we see people thinking that, oh, well, AIPAC is just trying to support Israel in the wake of these horrific attacks, not connecting the dots that AIPAC's attacks are on people in Congress, members of the squad who were elected by working class people to implement policies that support the working class and that are at odds with the majority of AIPAC's donors' interests. So people who want universal health care, who want a Green New Deal, who want living wages, who want housing, who want abortion access. All of these people are a threat to AIPAC's interests because they're a threat to AIPAC's donors. And so the members of the squad, we're talking about Reps Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Cori Bush, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Jamal Bowman, and now Reps Greg Kazar and Delia Ramirez. These are members these are progressive members who have been elected since 2019 as part of sort of a wave of progressive momentum, mobilization of working and poor voters who wanted to see members in Congress who represented their interests. And the success of that movement scared the living daylight out of AIPAC, and is part of the reason why they decided to start spending directly on elections to counter this influence. Because as the squad gained popularity and as the squad continued to win re-election, it sent a message to other members in Congress who toed a line, not just on Israel policy, but on corporate politics, on policies that support the elite and wealthy donors in this country, that they didn't have to do that they could win elections by supporting policies that were popular and that helped the working class. And as AIPAC realized that message was starting to spread, they realized that they decided that they wanted to do something about it.
Eva, have you also noticed this change in behavior and levels of spending, really, from AIPAC since October 7th?
I mean, the thing about AIPAC's strategy is that they've been on this trajectory since 2022. And so actually what we're seeing now in terms of AIPAC's influence in Congress is a result of when they ran this playbook of defeating key progressives who were running for Congress in 2022, and the current reluctance to support things like a ceasefire, conditioning weapons to Israel, an arms embargo for the weapons being used to bomb Gaza is a vestige of prior actions, and obviously also of their current projection around we're spending $100 million, we're going to take you out, we'll do to you what we did to Jamal. I do want to speak to the Tucker Carlson clip that you showed in a couple of different aspects.
Sure.
We can talk about Republicans in a bit, but the reason that we're talking about Democrats is because AIPAC's it's very important for AIPAC that their support is bipartisan. What's disingenuous about that clip and the way that Tucker is framing it, which is unsurprising considering who he is and what his politics are that Republicans in particular have an oil guy. They have a gun lobby guy. They have, there are plenty of special interest, extremely wealthy lobbyists for industries that and causes that are harmful to the American people, that are in Congress every single day talking to members of Congress. But Democrats' entire premise and brand and promise of their party is supposed to be that they are not accountable to those special interests. And they are trying to tell us that they are more accountable to the American people than to the oil lobby, the gun lobby, and all of these other special interest groups. And so the fact is that Democrats also have an AIPAC guy. And that's part of what we've been focusing on with the Reject AIPAC coalition for this past year, is that Democrats in particular should be treating AIPAC like all of these other far-right groups that are undemocratic, that do not represent the interests of Americans, of their constituents, and be rejecting AIPAC and not meeting with their lobbyists and not accepting their money in their elections. Because frankly, we would expect that from Republicans, and Democrats' entire premise for existing is that they do better.
I guess the result of this heavy involvement, left, right, and center, is a House of Representatives that votes to sanction the ICC for issuing arrest warrants for Israeli government officials.
The International Criminal Court has overstepped its authority and set a dangerous precedent by seeking arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israel's Defense Minister Gallant, alongside Hamas terrorists.
Usamah, can I get your take on this particular moment?
Yeah, I mean, it's deeply unsurprising to see Republicans carry the water for the far-right government in Israel. I wouldn't be surprised to see a few Democrats do the same and vote for resolutions like that, because as we've sort of said, AIPAC ensures this sort of unfettered, unconditional support for the Israeli government. So despite the fact that Ministers Netanyahu and Gallant are obviously war criminals from all semblances of that definition, we have Republicans in Congress saying, let's give them a pass. And that's sort of what we've seen throughout the last entire year. And that's the purpose of AIPAC, is to ensure that while the U.S. taxpayers are paying for the ethnic cleansing campaign of the Israeli government against the Palestinian people, we continue to send more and more taxpayer dollars, despite the fact that an overwhelming majority of Americans, especially Democratic voters, support a ceasefire. They support conditioning military funding to Israel. They support an arms embargo to Israel. And they believe what's happening constitutes a genocide. And so the way that AIPAC functions, as it always has, is in spite of public opinion. They have to spend millions of dollars in our elections because they have lost the war of public opinion. They are a right-wing organization. They're an organization deeply out of step with the majority of U.S. voters, especially U.S. Democratic voters. And for that reason, they have to spend $100 million in our elections to continue to elect candidates that reflect their donors' interests rather than the interests of these communities, be it in St. Louis or New York or anywhere else across the country.
Akela, how do you explain this disconnect? I mean, someone just talked about in spite of public opinion. How is this going on? It's 2024 and everyone is watching what's happening.
I think there are two things going on. One is that this is AIPAC's goal, right? They've been very successful in achieving their goal, which is to make it a political liability to raise questions about U.S. policy towards Israel, not even just criticizing it, but to even ask the question, should we have a discussion about this? Should we have a discussion about the fact that Israel has been the #1 recipient of U.S. military funding for X number of years, despite having all of these domestic, social and economic issues that aren't being addressed. The second piece of this is that Democrats have allowed AIPAC to continue doing this to their members. Democratic leadership are some of the top recipients of AIPAC money, have been extremely reluctant to speak out when AIPAC attacks its own members, despite being extremely vicious when those attacks against incumbent Democrats have come from their left or from some of these progressive members. And so Eva mentioned this point earlier, but Democrats are allowing this to happen. We know that Republicans are not going to be the ones to stand up against AIPAC, given the partisan political spectrum in the U.S. And so the fact that Democrats allow AIPAC to take out members of their own party who they find annoying or who they find difficult to work with, and that they are not accountable to anyone asking them, well, why are you letting this happen? Why are you saying on the one hand that you endorse all these members in your party who are under attack, while you're in the other hand you're taking millions of dollars from AIPAC and not making any comments about what they're doing. That's what is allowing this to continue to happen. The Democratic Party is extremely responsible for how AIPAC has been able to grow its influence, because without Democrats, without support from leaders, without support from more than half of members of the Democratic Party, AIPAC would not be able to do what it's doing right now.
And I mean, we're looking at some of the most important figures of the Democratic Party. Just before we saw Kamala Harris speaking at their conferences and stuff. So what you're saying is actually translated in pictures as we speak. In terms of where to from now and what to do about this, Eva, I wanted to share an idea that the Green Party presidential candidate, Jill Stein, had. Take a look.
AIPAC should be required to register as a foreign agent. And that would effectively shut down the inordinate influence that AIPAC has on behalf of the State of Israel. And unfortunately, because of the inordinate amount of money, I think it's $100 million that AIPAC is spending in this election, we do not have an adequate discussion and a debate, because it's become politically toxic to even speak out about this critical war.
Eva, AIPAC as a foreign agent, would you agree?
I think that a lot of people bring up this as a potential strategy. I think that what that ignores is the ways in which, obviously, yes, AIPAC has been an advocate for U.S. policy to be in lockstep with not even just any Israeli government, but specifically the Netanyahu government. We saw that the only time that AIPAC broke with U.S. foreign policy or a U.S. administration was during the Oslo Accords in the 90s, where they were more inclined to side with Netanyahu's far-right agenda for Israel. But I think that what this strategy ignores is the ways in which AIPAC is actually a specifically American phenomenon. Like Usamah mentioned, 9 out of its top 10 donors are Trump donors, and AIPAC is also effectively AIPAC's role in some ways is providing a democratic excuse to be, or forcing the Democratic Party to be in lockstep with a far-right Israeli government, and also with U.S. interest in unconditional support for Israel, both from the weapons contractor standpoint, from the fact that there are more members of Christians United for Israel, the organization, than there are Jews total in the United States, and the ways in which Christian Zionism is deeply embedded in the fabric of the both Republican Party and the white nationalist politics that they and their base espouse. And so AIPAC's role in some ways is to be sort of like the democratic, is to be sort of a moral veneer in some ways for democratic support for Israel around protecting Jews, which we've seen that, absolutely is completely false. And so that's the angle that we personally are taking around challenging the ways in which AIPAC as an American phenomenon, even though obviously they are playing an important role in terms of running interference for the extreme far-right Netanyahu government, as they have for decades.
Usamah, we're almost out of time. I would like one very quick take from you in terms of how to address this, which has become a crisis of sorts.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, we should be clear to understand that, you don't see this level of spending from a position of strength. AIPAC is on skates. AIPAC is on the defense because they know their positions and their policies are deeply out of step with the majority of Democratic voters. And so I think it's time, first and foremost, the number one thing we should be doing is taking big money out of politics. And I know that sounds far-fetched to a lot of folks in America who've seen our campaign finance system be corrupt for decades. But that is the first and most necessary step, because AIPAC has created a model for so many other super PACs and Republican billionaires to follow. We've seen the crypto industry do this. We've seen tech billionaires like Reid Hoffman create their own super PACs to do this. And so until we stem the unregulated influence of big money billionaires in politics, we're going to continue to have this problem. And AIPAC is just one of the biggest versions of that.
Understood. Take money out of politics, or at least big money out of politics. Usamah, Eva, and Akela, thank you so much for being part of the stream today. And thank you all for joining us. Don't forget, you can stay in touch with us on social media. You can send us your questions and suggestions using the hashtag or the handle AJStream, and we'll look into them. Take care, and I'll see you soon.